I came home one evening and found a road where my pasture used to be. Not a tire track, not a mistake, not some lost contractor making a bad turn. I mean a real gravel road, graded flat, packed tight, wide enough for dump trucks, running straight across my land like somebody had just decided my property was public infrastructure now. And the worst part was, when I called the man responsible, he laughed like I was bothering him during dinner. I had bought those 16 acres outside Hollow Bend, Kentucky, back in 2011, back when Hollow Bend was still the kind of place where the gas station clerk knew what truck you drove, and the biggest traffic jam in town was 2 tractors meeting at the feed store. I was not looking for luxury. I was not trying to flit land. I just wanted quiet. I wanted a porch where I could drink coffee without hearing leaf blowers, a field where my old blue heeler could chase rabbits he never caught, and enough room between me and everybody else that no one felt invited to comment on my mailbox, my grass, or whether I left a ladder leaning against the barn too long. The property was not fancy. That is the truth. The fences were tired, the soil had rocks in it, and the little creek along the back line dried up every August like it had bills to pay. But it was mine, and there is a kind of peace in that word that people who only see land as money will never understand. Behind my place sat about 60 acres of timber and brush that had been empty for years. Deer bedded down there. Kids sometimes snuck in during turkey season, and once in a while I would hear chainsaws way off in the distance. But mostly it just sat there like land used to sit before everybody decided every empty field needed a logo and a sales office. Then, one Saturday in early April, I saw pink survey tape tied to branches along the far tree line. I remember standing there with my coffee, wearing slippers in wet grass, thinking, well, here we go. A week later came the excavators. After that came trucks, then more trucks. Then a giant sign by the county road with fake stone pillars and gold letters that said, "Future home of Silver Oak Preserve." Preserve. That was the part that made me laugh. They had already knocked down half the trees before the sign dried. The developer was a man named Mason Vale, and if you are picturing the kind of guy who wears spotless boots to a muddy job site, congratulations, you have met Mason without meeting him. He drove a white Mercedes SUV that looked like it had never carried anything heavier than a gym bag, and he had his name printed at the bottom of that sign like he was donating a hospital wing instead of selling overpriced houses to people who wanted country views without country smells. Now, at first, I kept my mouth shut. I figured they must have their access worked out, because that is what grown adults do before they bring in bulldozers, right? They check maps. They check titles. They check easements. They ask questions before moving dirt. That was me being naive. I left before sunrise one Monday for a roofing job, 2 counties over, came back tired, sunburned, and smelling like tar. And the second I turned into my driveway, I felt that strange little drop in my stomach that tells you something is wrong before your brain has caught up. There was dust hanging low over the front pasture. Fresh mud was pushed up along the fence line. My dog, Roscoe, was standing stiff near the porch, ears forward, staring at the field like he had seen a ghost with a CDL license. Then I saw it, a fresh gravel road cut right across the south corner of my land, starting at the county road and running back toward Mason's development, clean as a ribbon, ugly as a scar. I stopped the truck halfway in the drive and just sat there with my hands on the wheel. I remember the engine ticking, the smell of hot dust, the way the evening light hit those white stones and made them look almost pretty, which somehow made me angrier. Pretty damage is still damage. I got out and walked it end to end. There were deep tire marks from concrete trucks already pressed into the gravel, big boot prints along the edge, orange stakes hammered into soil I paid taxes on, and not one person had called me, mailed me, knocked on my door, left a note, nothing. They had not confused the property line. They had not wandered 10 feet over by accident. They had built a construction road across my land because it was the shortest route, and apparently shortest was all the permission they needed. I found the number on the Silver Oak sign and called it before I even got back to the porch. Mason answered on the 3rd ring, calm as a man ordering lunch. I said, "This is Daniel Mercer. You built a road through my pasture." There was this tiny pause. Then he chuckled, not nervously, not apologetically, just amused, and said, "Daniel, it is temporary access. We are not hurting anything out there." That one sentence did something to me. We are not hurting anything. I looked down at the gravel under my boots, at the grass buried beneath it, at the line of crushed field running through the place I'd worked 11 years to keep simple. And I said, "You are on my land." His voice changed, then, just a little. He got smoother. like men do when they are about to explain your own life to you. He said, "Our engineers believe that corner may connect to an old agricultural access route, possibly historical, and we're improving the area anyway, so I think everybody is going to benefit here." I actually smiled, not because it was funny, but because sometimes arrogance is so pure it becomes educational. I said, "Mason, may connect and possibly historical are not the same thing as permission." He sighed like I was being difficult. He said, "Look, I understand rural folks get protective, but this development is going to raise values all around Hollow Bend." That was the moment I understood what kind of man I was dealing with. Not a confused man, not a careless man. A man who believed progress was whatever helped his bank account, and anybody standing in front of it was just emotional, backward, or waiting to be bought. I told him to stop using the road immediately. He told me we should all stay reasonable. I said, "Reasonable would have been asking before you put gravel on my property." He went quiet, then said, "We can talk numbers if that makes this easier." There it was. The real language. Not sorry, not we made a mistake. Just how much to make you stop being a problem. I hung up without answering. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside became a truck in my head. Every sweep of headlights across the bedroom wall made me sit up. I kept thinking about my father, who never owned much of anything except an old Ford and a work ethic that probably killed him early, telling me when I signed the papers on that place, "Land does not make you rich, son, but it gives you somewhere to stand." And now some man with polished shoes had looked at my somewhere to stand and treated it like a shortcut. By morning, I'd taken pictures of everything, the tire marks, the stakes, the gravel, the road from every angle, even Roscoe sitting beside it looking personally offended. And then I called Leland Price, an attorney in Barrow County who had handled more fence fights, boundary wars, and family land feuds than anyone I knew. Leland was 70, if he was a day, smoked cigars he was not supposed to smoke, and had the personality of a locked filing cabinet. But when I explained what happened, he got real quiet and said, "Please tell me you took pictures before calling that peacock." I told him I did. He said, "Good, because men like that do not remember facts. They remember opportunities." By noon, I was sitting in his office while he pulled my deed, the title report, the county plats, and every recorded easement attached to the property. There was no access right across my south pasture, no shared road, no historical route, no little legal ghost hiding in the paperwork, waiting to bless Mason's gravel. Nothing. Leland leaned back in his chair, tapped the deed with one yellowed finger, and said, "Well, Daniel, either this man is stupid, or he thinks you are." I said, "Maybe both." He almost smiled. That afternoon, he drafted a formal cease and desist, demanding that Mason's company stop using the road immediately and restore the land to its prior condition. It was clean, professional, and colder than a church basement in January. We sent it certified mail and had a process server deliver a copy to the Silver Oak site office. I thought that would at least slow them down. It did not. 2 mornings later, before the sun was fully up, I woke to the sound of diesel engines rolling across my pasture, and when I looked out the kitchen window, there they were, dump trucks, pickups, a cement mixer, all crawling over that illegal road like the letter had been an invitation. I stood there in my kitchen, with one hand on the coffee mug and the other gripping the edge of the sink, watching those trucks roll across my pasture like the judge. The deed, the letter, and basic human decency were all optional features. Roscoe was growling low beside me, which was funny in a sad way because that dog had more respect for property lines than half the men wearing hard hats that morning. I called Leland, and before I even finished saying "they are back," he said, "I figured they would be. People do not cross a line like that once unless they already decided lines are for other people." By 9 o'clock, we were filing for trespass and emergency injunctive relief, which sounds very fancy. But in plain English it meant, "Your Honor, please make this man stop driving over my land before I lose my mind and do something stupid with the tractor." The hearing was set for Friday, and those 4 days stretched out like a bad winter. Every morning trucks came through, not as many as before, but enough to let me know Mason had no intention of respecting anything unless someone with a robe forced him to. I took more pictures. I recorded license plates. I stood by the fence with my phone out while drivers looked everywhere except at me. One guy in a red pickup actually rolled his window down and said, "Man, I just go where they tell me." I said, "I understand that, but today they told you to trespass." He gave me this helpless shrug, like responsibility was something that got lost between payroll and the steering wheel, then kept driving. That was the part that started to bother me more than the road itself. Nobody involved acted shocked. Nobody acted nervous. The contractors, the surveyors, the equipment operators, they all moved like this was normal. Like a private field was just an inconvenience waiting to be converted into a route. By the time Friday came, I had not slept more than 4 hours a night, and I walked into that courthouse feeling like I had gravel under my skin. Mason was already there, of course, standing in the hallway with his lawyer and 2 men in expensive jackets who looked like investors or maybe decorative witnesses. He wore a navy sport coat, tan pants, loafers with no socks, and a smile that said he had never once had to load shingles in July. When he saw me, he gave me a little nod, friendly as a salesman at a boat show, and said, "Daniel, I hate that it had to get this far." I looked at him for a second and said, "Mason, you brought bulldozers to my land before you brought manners, so I guess here we are." His smile twitched, just a little, but I saw it, and I will admit, it felt good. Inside the courtroom, his attorney tried to make it sound like the whole thing was a paperwork misunderstanding, a grey area, a regrettable confusion caused by old local usage patterns and practical development needs. I had to admire the performance in the same way you admire a raccoon opening a trash can, annoying but skilled. He said the rear parcel had limited access, that construction timelines were already underway, that crews had relied on engineering assumptions, and that stopping access now would cause serious financial harm to a project that would bring new housing, tax revenue, and economic growth to the Hollow Bend community. Economic growth, tax revenue, new housing. He stacked those phrases up like hymnals, hoping the judge would hear public good instead of private shortcut. Then Leland stood up, slow as smoke, buttoned his jacket with hands that looked like they had signed 1,000 bad days into order, and said, "Your Honor, the defendant has offered many reasons why trespassing was useful, but not one reason why it was legal." The room went so quiet, I could hear somebody's watch ticking. Mason's lawyer jumped in, saying there may have been historic access, and Leland turned slightly, not even looking impressed, and said, "May have been is not a deed, counsel." I nearly laughed out loud, but I bit the inside of my cheek, because courtrooms are not the place to celebrate too early. The judge, a tired-looking woman named Elaine Porter, flicked through the plats, the title report, the photos, then looked over her glasses at Mason and asked, "Mr. Tobidhanimus Eve, Vile, did your company have a recorded easement across Mr. Mercer's property at the time this road was built?" Mason's lawyer started to answer, and she held up one hand. "I asked Mr. Vale." Mason cleared his throat, and for the first time since I had heard his voice, the polish came off. He said, "We believed there was a reasonable basis to proceed." Judge Porter said, "That was not my question. Did you have one?" Mason looked down at the table. "No, Your Honor." She sat back and said, "Then you did not have access. You had confidence, and confidence is not a property right. I swear, if my father had still been alive, I would have called him from the courthouse steps just to repeat that sentence." The judge granted the injunction. Mason's company was ordered to stop using my land immediately, remove the gravel road, and restore the pasture within 14 days. I walked out of that courtroom with the kind of relief that makes your knees feel loose, like your body was holding up a wall and suddenly somebody else stepped in to help. Mason did not speak to me on the way out. He walked past with his jaw tight, his lawyer whispering in his ear, and those 2 investor-looking men staring at their phones like bad news was arriving in real time. For about 3 days, the road went quiet. No trucks, no dust, no diesel. Just birds and wind and Roscoe pretending he had personally won the injunction. I thought maybe that was it. I thought Mason, being a man who liked money, would understand that ignoring a court order was more expensive than admitting defeat. That was also me being naive, apparently a hobby of mine that month. On day 5, a white pickup came through before sunrise. On day 6, 2 utility trucks. On day 8, I watched a concrete mixer creep across the gravel like a thief trying not to wake the floorboards. They were not using it openly anymore, not with full convoys, but they were still using it, testing me, testing the order, testing whether ordinary people get tired before rich people get punished. Leland filed enforcement papers, but the court moved at court speed, which is to say a glacier with reading glasses, and I could feel something changing in me during those days. I have always been a calm man. Maybe too calm. I was raised to avoid fuss, to shake hands, to let small things go because life is hard enough without making enemies. But this was not small anymore. This was a man teaching me, in real time, that patience without consequences is just permission with better manners. So, on the 9th morning, I drove to a fencing company outside Redford and bought the heaviest steel farm gate they could install on short notice. Not a decorative gate, not some polite little ranch entrance with a cute name welded on it. I mean a serious gate, galvanized steel, double-braced, hang-on posts set deep in concrete, with an industrial lock that looked like it belonged on a prison laundry room. The foreman, a big woman named Carla, with sunburned arms and a voice like gravel in a bucket, met me at the road and looked down the illegal access cut. She said, "Somebody built this without asking?" I said, "Yes, Mom." She spit into the dust and said, "Then let's ruin their morning." I liked Carla immediately. By late afternoon, the gate stood right where the gravel road entered from the county road, silver in the sun, solid as a judge's signature. I had them trenched shallow along both sides too. Not enough to damage drainage, just enough to remind any hero in a pickup that going around would not be clever. It would be expensive. When Carla snapped the lock shut, the sound carried across the field, one clean metallic click, and I felt something settle inside me for the first time in weeks. It was not revenge exactly. It was not even anger. It was the feeling of putting a door back on a house after strangers had been walking through your living room. The next morning, I made coffee before sunrise and sat on the porch with Roscoe at my feet. I knew they would come. People like Mason do not believe in locked doors until they bruise their nose on one. Around 7:30, the first dump truck turned off the county road, then another behind it, then a concrete supplier, then a line of pickups with men who clearly had not been briefed on the new architecture. The lead truck rolled up to the gate and stopped. Brake lights glowed red in the morning mist. A driver climbed down, walked up, rattled the steel, then stepped back and stared at it like maybe the gate had appeared by witchcraft. Another man tried the lock. A third pulled out his phone. Then the convoy just sat there, engines rumbling, blocked by one piece of steel Mason should have seen coming from 10 miles away. My phone rang at 7:43. I remember because I looked at the screen and smiled before I answered. Mason did not say hello. He said, "What the hell do you think you are doing?" I took a sip of coffee, probably louder than necessary, and said, "Enjoying a quiet morning on my own property." He said, "You are shutting down an entire development over a temporary road." I said, "No, Mason. You shut it down when you built your temporary road on permanent private land." He started talking fast then. Lost revenue, delivery windows, subcontractor penalties, investors, homes already sold, families waiting. The whole orchestra of consequences he suddenly wanted me to feel responsible for. I let him run until he needed air. Then I said, "Here is the thing. You keep calling it access, that from where I am standing, it looks a lot like trespassing with a schedule." He cursed, not loud, but sharp. Then he said, "I will bury you in court." I looked out at that line of trucks, every one of them burning fuel and money, while my gate did exactly what the deed said it could do. And I said, "Mason, you already took me to court without an easement. How did that go for you?" Then I hung up. I do not know what Mason did right after I hung up, but I like to imagine him standing there in his spotless loafers, staring at a line of trucks he could not move, realizing for the first time that land does not care how confident you are. For the next few days, Silver Oak Preserve looked less like a luxury development and more like a beehive somebody had kicked and then abandoned. Trucks came in from the other side, turned around, parked along the shoulder. Drivers paced with clipboards, subcontractors called supervisors, supervisors called Mason, and Mason, from what I heard later, called everybody except the one person he should have called in the beginning, which was me, with an apology. By the end of that first week, behind the gate, the county had frozen several of his inspections because access and drainage plans no longer matched what had been approved. And once government paperwork smells confusion, it starts breeding more paperwork. The site engineer had to resubmit plans. The concrete company delayed pause. Kramer started shifting crews to other jobs. And the investors who had once treated Mason like the golden boy of rural development suddenly wanted answers in writing. That is the funny thing about rich men and momentum. When everything is moving forward, they call it vision. But when it stops, they start looking for someone to blame. Mason blamed me, naturally. He filed for emergency relief, asking Judge Porter to force temporary access through my pasture while he pursued another route, which was about the boldest thing I had ever heard, considering he was asking the court to rescue him from the consequences of ignoring the same court. We were back in that courtroom 3 weeks later. This time, Mason did not look like a man arriving to sell a dream. He looked tired. His jacket was still expensive, his hair still perfect, but there was something tight around his eyes, something hunted. And I remember thinking, there it is. That is what happens when entitlement finally meets a locked gate. His lawyer argued hardship. He argued economic damage. He said homes were under contract, families were waiting, contractors were suffering, the community would lose tax revenue, and the whole project might be delayed for months if access was not granted. Judge Porter let him talk for a while. Then she leaned forward and said, "Counsel, your client was ordered to cease use of this property and restore it, yet the record shows continued use after that order. Why should this court reward non-compliance by granting the very access he had no right to take?" Mason's lawyer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and found nothing worth saying. Leland did not even have to stand long. He said, "Your Honor, Mr. Varley created urgency by trespassing, then created hardship by refusing to stop, and now he asks the court to convert his misconduct into leverage. That is not equity. That is a business strategy with mud on its boots. I looked down because I did not want the judge to see me smiling. The request was denied. Full stop. No temporary access. No emergency shortcut. No court-ordered permission slip for a road he'd invented with gravel and nerve. When we walked outside, Mason came up behind me on the courthouse steps and said my name like it tasted bad. Daniel. I turned around. He stood there with his jaw working, trying to decide whether to threaten me, charm me, or write a check big enough to make me forget the last 2 months. Finally, he said, "You know you could have made money on this if you had been reasonable." I said, "Mason, you keep confusing reasonable with useful to you." He shook his head and said, "People like you always fight progress until they want the benefits." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I did not feel angry. I felt almost sorry for him, because he truly believed that if something made him richer, the rest of us were supposed to clap. I said, "Progress knocks before it crosses a fence." Then I walked to my truck. After that, things got ugly for Silver Oak in a way that had nothing to do with me anymore. Mason had another possible access point on the east side of the property, a narrow strip owned by a retired school principal named Mrs. Mott, Evelyn Coates, who had spent 40 years teaching 8th graders and had the negotiating instincts of a bank robber. Before Mason's trouble became public, that strip probably would have sold for 20 grand and a polite lunch. After everybody in Hollowbend knew he needed it to keep his subdivision alive, Mrs. Coates suddenly remembered that land was precious, her grandchildren were expensive, and she was in no hurry whatsoever. I heard she made him pay $130,000 for a strip barely wide enough to deserve its own shadow. Then came the redesigned road plans, new drainage studies, revised permits, legal fees, delays, idle equipment, contract penalties, and crews that had to be rescheduled, like dominoes falling uphill. I do not know the final number, and Mason certainly never sent me an itemized bill. But people around town said the mistake cost him somewhere north of $500,000 by the time the dust settled. Maybe that is gossip. Small towns do season their facts before serving them, but I know this much. He paid dearly, and not because I was clever, not because I was powerful, but because he'd bet that I would be too tired, too broke, or too polite to defend what was mine. The court finally forced full restoration of my pasture, and I will never forget the morning those crews came to remove that road. There was no grand music, no cheering crowd, just a grey sky, cold wind, and men in mud-stained work pants scraping up gravel they never should have laid down. I stood by the fence with Roscoe beside me, watching the loader bite into that white stone and peel it back from the earth one bucket at a time. It was strangely quiet, almost solemn. Even the workers did not joke much. Maybe they knew they were not just removing a road, they were erasing a bad decision. Carla drove by later, slowed down, looked at the open field, and called out, "Looks better without the trespassing highway." I said, "Yes, Mom, it really does." By the time Silver Oak Preserve finally opened, nearly a year behind schedule, it had the same polished entrance sign, the same fake rustic street lamps, the same houses painted in shades of oatmeal and fog, but every time I drove past, I saw something nobody else could see. I saw Mason's trucks sitting helpless behind my gate in the morning mist. I saw Judge Porter looking over her glasses and reminding a man with money that confidence was not a property right. I saw my father, in my memory, telling me land gives you somewhere to stand. And I realized that was what the whole fight had really been about. Not gravel, not money, not even one arrogant developer. It was about whether a regular person still has the right to say no when someone bigger, louder, and better funded decides your boundaries are inconvenient. People ask me sometimes if I regret not taking the money. Honestly, some days I think about it. I could have used it. I had a roof that needed replacing, a truck that coughed every winter, and dog who somehow had more medical bills than I did. But taking the money would have meant accepting the lie that what Mason did was just business. It was not. It was trespassing dressed up in a polo shirt. And maybe that sounds stubborn, but I sleep just fine behind that gate. So here is my question for you, and I mean it, because people are split on this whenever I tell the story. If a developer built across your land without permission, then offered you a check after getting caught, would you take the money and move on, or would you fight until every stone was removed? Tell me in the comments who you think was right, who went too far, and whether protecting your property is worth risking peace in a small town. Because after what happened in Hollow Bend, I can tell you this much: nobody around here looks at a fence line quite the same way anymore.